All right. Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. We hope you are safe and well. We hope that you are in good spirits mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, ideologically, in whatever capacity. We are so happy you are here with us today. We have an amazing group of panelists here. We're so excited that they have joined us today. And we are very, very fortunate that we get to hear about their voyage to Cuba today. And so we want to just do quick introductions, especially if this is your first time being with us here for our seminar broadcast. So we'll start off by acknowledging our comrades, our indigenous comrades, giving honor and glory to them, understanding that we are on their land. If you think about the very tip tops of Canada, all the way to the very bottom of Chile, all of that is indigenous land. And so without any hesitation, we are clear as members of the All African People's Revolutionary Party that without them, we would not be on this soil. And so we acknowledge that we are working diligently to help fight with them so that they can get their land back. And we're humbled and grateful that they are fighting with us to help us as African people get our land back as well. Also, with this being a broadcast for the All African People's Revolutionary Party, you may be joining us for the first time, so you may not know what our intention is. Well, the All African People's Revolutionary Party is a revolutionary, independent, mass Pan-African political organization that is based out of Africa. It's very important to note that because a lot of times when we come across different Pan-Africanist organizations, or even just organizations that are designed to help African people, there's not really an understanding from a political education standpoint that a lot of the issues that African people are facing stem from being on the continent. And so the difference between this organization and others is that we understand that the solutions, the objectives, the outcomes that we're looking to gain in terms of changing the conditions for African people, it can't start anywhere but on the continent, and nor can it end anywhere. And so we're very proud to say that we have chapters all over the world, but our primary work is done on the ground, on the continent. We have chapters throughout the continent. And the work that we do is so important because it's rooted in us understanding that we have to do everything we can to change the conditions on the ground so that we can impact the outcome that is happening for African people everywhere. This also includes us working with sibling organizations that are also based out of Africa. And so we're working to achieve Pan-Africanism. Well, that basically means that we're pulling from Kwame Nkrumah's definition, and you see one of the books he wrote there at the bottom, Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. But Pan-Africanism just basically means that we believe that Africa should be one unified socialist Africa. And we understand that with socialism, that gives African people more control to determine the resources, to determine how those resources impact the outcome and the treatment that African people everywhere are receiving. Again, this problem started at home on the continent, so we understand that there's some serious outcomes that can occur if we're able to change those conditions. Right now, African people do not own our land. And so because of that, the land itself is exploited. So therefore, why would the people be treated with any respect when the land itself is not valued? And so just having that understanding, and this is also why we're connected to indigenous people, because we understand that they don't own their land. This is why we're connected to Palestinian people, because we understand they're not in ownership of their land, and so on and so forth. And so this seminar is usually brought to you by Comrade Ajamu Umi, who is my father biologically and ideologically, and then myself. My name is Shukura Umi. We are very happy and proud to do this seminar weekly, but as I said, today we have some special guests. We're so excited to hear from these folks today. So we hope that you all will be able to tune in and listen attentively. Also, because we have some very phenomenal guests, we're gonna open up our chats. If you're joining us through YouTube, feel free to put some questions in the chat. If you're joining us through Facebook or Twitter, feel free to put questions in the chat, and we will get to those later in the program and hopefully be able to answer them. But I do want to acknowledge who we are hearing from today. So I'll give a quick introduction of the Hood Communist Collective, and then we'll be able to hear introductions from the panelists themselves. And then afterwards, I'll give some discussion questions to get us started before we open up the chat to hear from you all and your questions. Okay, so sit back, relax, and let's get ready to be informed and empowered politically as we educate ourselves. So Hood Communists is a collective organization, and we are honored to have these comrades from this collective here to discuss their recent trip to Cuba. If you don't know, Hood Communist is a revolutionary blog of African voices with perspectives all over the African world on the struggle for justice and liberation for African people and all oppressed peoples. And this age of accommodationist politics and integrating into the capitalist system through this imaginary concept of, quote, wealth building, end quote, Hood Communists emerged as a principled voice for revolutionary change as a solution to the problems of African people faced around the world. Today, we are honored to have our comrades from Hood Communists here to discuss their recent trip to Socialist Cuba. And before they do that, we want to give each Hood Communist editor the opportunity to introduce themselves. And please note, these are not people who have just advanced individual opinions. All of them are in organizations working for justice. So just like we say every week to join an organization working for justice, we see the value in having you hear from folks who are practicing that every day. So without further ado, I'll ask our comrades to start alphabetically and give a brief introduction of you all, and then I will start the discussion questions. Thank you.
Okay, peace everyone. My name is Erica Keynes. I am currently the coordinating committee vice chair of the Black Alliance for Peace, which is an anti-war, anti-imperialist alliance of individuals and organizations focused on the Black radical peace tradition and plethora of campaigns that connect domestic to global imperialism. I am also founder of Liberation Through Reading, which gives books to African children that by African authors that are African centered. And I am a member of Ujima People's Progress Party, which is, you can hear my son in the background, excuse me. But it is a Black workers centered political electoral party here in Maryland.
Peace, everybody. Also, Assalamu alaikum and Ramadan Mubarak. As of today, happy Ramadan, everybody. My name is Musa Springer. I am one of the editors at Hood Communist, also a organizing member with the Black Alliance for Peace Atlanta Citywide Alliance, where we're primarily focused on connecting the issues of how US imperialism and militarization through programs like the 1033 program or the Cop City Project impact Africans in the city of Atlanta. I'm also the international youth representative for the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente, which is a popular education, neighborhood-based organization in Havana, Cuba, and Matanzas, but in different places in Cuba. And I'm very happy and thankful to be here, and I'll pass it.
And greetings. My name is Onya Sanru Chatoyer. I'm also an editor with Hood Communists. I'm also on the Central Committee of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, and I'm also on the Council of the All African Women's Revolutionary Union. Shakur already explained in amazing detail precisely what the PRP and AWRU are. Then I'll also add I'm on the National Coordinating Committee of the Ben Stamos Brigade, which is the oldest Cuba delegation in the U.S. Happy to be here.
All right. Thank y'all so much. Wow. We're in for a treat, y'all. Okay. All right. So without further ado, first question. Tell us why Hood Communist Collective went to Cuba.
So we were invited by our comrades in ECAP, the Cuban Institute of Friendship with the Peoples, as well as the Cuban Communist Party, to participate in the second annual conference of theoretical publications of the left. I feel like that's not the full name, but it's close enough. And basically, it was anti-imperialist and revolutionary socialist newspapers, particularly those of like political parties, gathered all in one space in Havana from 37 different countries, as well as from Cuba, to talk about the need to unify across the anti-imperialist movement to combat imperialist propaganda. And then I'll definitely let my comrades add anything else.
Yeah, while we were there, we were able to give some remarks, each of us. So we wrote those remarks collectively. They are each published on Hood Communist currently. We also published a declaration in support of Palestine that towards the end of the 3-day conference that each of us who were involved came in unity with and signed on to. And then that's also published. And we also were able to publish the full Hamas and resistance statement that was shared at the conference. We thought it was really important to share that because the emphasis that they placed on having the voices of Palestinians heard clearly was necessary. It was something that was expressed during the conference by the cohort of Palestinians that were there, which included students and Palestinians that were involved in some capacity with the resistance struggle. So it was really important for us to do that, but we were also able to speak to specific things around Fidel's battle of ideas, also around, the recapturing of youth, media literacy, and, our role as journalists, I guess, but more importantly, as media entities, excuse me, of our organizations, what is our role? So those were a lot of things that were discussed while we were there, not just by us, but collectively amongst the, organizations and media entities that were there as well.
And the only thing that I could add to that, because the two of these sisters did such a wonderful job laying it all out, is that it was organized and we were invited by the Communist Party of Cuba with support from IFCO and some other organizations. And so I think it's always important to name that it was like organizers inside the party who invited these people from around the world and put this together for the second year in a row. And it's very inspiring to see an event of this level so well organized, and it shows the importance of organization in action and practice. And then while we were there in our free time, I was able to help organize some meetings and arrangements and special projects, essentially with the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente. And so we kind of joked and said it was like a delegation within a delegation. Erica was able to take her wonderful project, Liberation Through Reading, and distribute books in the La Lisa neighborhood in Havana. We were able to talk with Black Cuban organizers and really just ground with them. And that was, a very welcome part of it as well.
Yes, I just think that is so freaking awesome. So first of all, congratulations to Hood Communist Collective for being invited. To me, it seems like, that's a high honor, but clearly you all have done the work. And so I'm super gigging out over here. That's really awesome. And it sounds like y'all were able, like you said, Comrade Musa, to, do some interdisciplinary work in addition to being there for the intention of what that conference was about. I loved how you mentioned media literacy, Erica. I cannot stress enough, like, how important that is. And I know Cuba prioritizes that as well. Also super exciting that you were able to share books with the children. I just think that's awesome. And then Comrade Onye, I think it's really awesome that, we're looking at how we can work together collectively, socialism, to still take down imperialism, even if it relates to media, right? Because any way that we can tackle imperialism is still a better way that we can still continue to organize. And so just props to all of you for doing the work, right? For being so consistent. And did y'all hear they already have articles published? So y'all can look on their site right now and read about what they did. That is so awesome. Okay, so the next question is, talk to us about where you see the Cuban Revolution standing today. That's the first part of that question. The second part is, what is the support for the revolution? And then if you can just tell us why you feel that way and where do you see it going? And I'd be happy to repeat the question or put it in the chat if y'all need that.
Yeah, I don't mind going first and taking a stab. This is a big question, obviously. Even in Cuba right now, there's a variety of answers to this question, but I think that the revolution is still standing strong in the fact that they are still a socialist state with a strong socialist communist party um, running the civil society essentially. And right now, the revolution is going through what a lot of us call a second special period. So in the 90s, when the USSR collapsed, the Cuban economy collapsed, and there was essentially the revolution was threatened, right? There was almost a complete collapse of Cuba, and they managed to pull through. Around the time of COVID, plus the 65-year imperialist blockade by the United Snakes of America, um, the pandemic plus the blockade combined really has put them in a second special period where things are very difficult on the island. The US is quite literally starving Cubans every single day, taking medicine out of their mouths. And so, like, this is really what people are focused on. People are focused on surviving. And Cubans have a lot of self awareness, a lot of political awareness. And so, I think Cubans tend to be very aware that their conditions are because of the blockade in Cuba. But the goal of the blockade, which the CIA itself says, is to starve and oppress Cubans so much that they turn on their own, revolution, on their own government. And so we've seen more Cubans leaving the island than ever before because the blockade is getting so tight. But still, the revolutionary spirit is very strong. They're making changes, every week legislatively. For example, they just recently raised the salaries of teachers. There's a new program to bring new food rations to elderly people. And they're now working on adjustments to lower the gas prices because there's been gas shortages for a few years now. So the Cuban situation is really difficult, but the Cuban Revolution is still standing, not least because of solidarity from people like us, but as well as solidarity from governments and states and collectives all around the world.
Yeah, well, I can just add, in terms of support, I think this conference really sort of highlighted that. A lot of what was the focus alongside the battle of ideas was unity as a strategical tool for overcoming this sort of propaganda. So we talked obviously about Fidel's battle of ideas, but a lot of what we talked about once leaving, what did we take away from it? And a lot of the discussions has been, while we encourage these delegations, we're also acutely aware of how these sort of postmodernist conceptions that have kind of trickled down from academia to nonprofits, to social media, into our organizing spaces have sort of through these delegations, attempted to also project the US-centric understanding onto the island, which in turn validates a sort of calls for regime change. And we can see a prevalent reminder of that in the July 2021 protests in Cuba, which named and attacked the island as anti-Black, but also a police state. And so we understand our role as Pan-Africanists, as Black internationalists, and as comrades to the Cuban Revolution as like a necessary intervention to that type of propaganda by telling the truth about Cuba consistently and raising the primary contradiction of imperialism, US imperialism specifically, but also the blockade and putting that at the forefront. And I, commend Musa and Onye for always, always, always being, very, very insistent that that should always be the prominent understanding that all of these other issues exist or may exist, certainly, but it exists because of that primary contradiction of the blockade. And we understand our role as a media entity as always being able to express that and putting that to the forefront.
I think these Africans got it. And the only thing I'd add is that the condition of the new special period that Musa described is a direct result of US policy. When the Trump administration was in power, they applied over 200 additional sanctions to Cuba. They called it a maximum pressure campaign. They timed them to coincide with the shutdown of Cuba's tourism industry because of COVID-19, because Cuba, unlike the United States, prioritizes the lives of the people that live there. And they're like, we can't have tourism because it's going to spread COVID. So we're going to make a great sacrifice and shut down the primary means that we make income, thanks to the blockade, in order to protect our population. The US took that opportunity to apply, again, over 200 additional sanctions. to impose maximum suffering on the Cuban people. The target is civilians. Then Biden campaigns on returning to Obama-era policies towards Cuba, which are like a little bit more relaxed, especially in terms of economics and also travel. But Biden lies. That's what they be doing. And so Biden kept in place the Trump administration sanctions, and the State Department under Biden maintained Cuba's listing on the state sponsors of terrorism list, which basically bans Cuba from engaging in like basic bank transactions. That's a large part of the reason why you can't use US dollars in a lot of parts of Cuba anymore, because they literally cannot spend them on the global market. So it's the condition that Cuba is in right now is a direct consequence of bipartisan US policy. It's very important to understand, and it's very, very frustrating listening to people in the US with all their uninformed criticisms of Cuba that don't keep in mind, like Erica described, that primary contradiction of the US blockade of US policy towards Cuba created conditions on the island as they are.
Yep. I hope y'all see I'm over here nodding my head and I'm like, that's right. Because I think you all hit not only on this question, but also to a certain extent the next question, but just much gratitude to all three of you for like being real. And I feel like you all answered the question collectively, but also like individually and still kind of gave some different ways. So Comrade Musa, I really appreciate you saying like, this is real. People are leaving because they're starving. Like that's understandable. But I also appreciate you saying, but the spirit can't be broken, right? I heard that part and that my heart was breaking a little bit. And then I heard it and I was like, okay, so we still know what we have to do. We have to keep feeding the spirit. We have to keep believing. We have to keep working together because we can overcome this. Comrade Erica, I appreciate you mentioning that we need to call a spade a spade. Let's talk about how all of this happened because the US is pissed that they can't have their way and Cuba is clearly dominating them. And they don't really want to admit that. So they're going to do everything they can to stop these people because, as you said, Comrade Onye, people's lives don't matter, right? And I continue to just think about how amazing we are as a people to be as lucky as we are that the people of Cuba not only have intentions to help other people. I still think about how they sent doctors around the world to help when the quarantine first started. I still think about how they were willing to share that antiviral treatment with anyone. I mean, as a public health advocate, that's always been my example in terms of like how we really do things. And so just hearing about the impact of what the blockade has done, it's a conversation that needs to continue happening. I feel like we need to continue making people as uncomfortable as possible talking about it because America is so great, then why are you making other people starve? Let's just be honest about that. Let's call a spade and let's talk about how you're making them starve because you're pissed that you will never be able to make the health outcomes or even the economic outcomes that they're making. And it makes you mad as hell. So you're going to do everything you can to stop them. But you can't stop them though. You can't because there's too many of us. And hopefully by the time this seminar is over, more people will start to want to study socialism a little bit more because we do need more people on deck with us. So moving on to the next question, which is about socialism. Cuba is a socialist country. In plain terms, can you talk about the fundamental difference between their socialist system and the capitalist world and why any of this matters? And I know y'all have already kind of hinted to this, but if you have other final thoughts or closing thoughts, we would love to hear them.
So first and foremost, Cuba has what's known as a planned economy, meaning that rather than organizing year to year around what is going to make the most money for a small amount of people at any particular time, Cuba engages in long-term economic planning studies like what is the size of the population? What are the demographics from the population? How many people need consistent medical care? How many people are elders? How many people are kids? What are the housing needs? What are the education needs? What are the resources we need to meet those needs? And based on that analysis, based on that research, they plan their economy long term to meet the needs of their people. The only way that Cuba has been able to survive intentionally genocidal US blockade is through that long-term economic planning under a socialist economic system. That's the only way that they have been able to sustain themselves because they understand precisely what the needs of their population are, and their economy is organized around those needs. The other thing you see within a social society that you see very clearly in Cuba is the organization of the entire Cuban population around the maintaining of the Cuban state. There are dozens of mass organizations in Cuba, like for example, the Federation of Cuban Women. There's the Committees for Defense of the Revolution, which are like block by block neighborhood organizations responsible for like maintaining the care and needs of those neighborhoods. Like every sector of the Cuban society is organized around building their revolution as like a living entity. let's see, another part of Cuban socialism is direct democracy, meaning that they have direct input through those mass organizations into the organization of the Cuban state, as well as the new legislation that is passed in Cuban society, like the new Cuban Family Code. So at every sector of the Cuban socialist system, you see direct democratic participation by the masses of people through mass people's organizations. You see that long-term economic planning to meet the needs of that population. And you also see working class control of the means of production. Those are some factors of Cuban socialism. And I'm sure I missed something, so I'm going to open it up to the other comments.
Well, I was just gonna add to your point about the planned economy. What Cuba kind of fixates on is a particular framework that we use, the Black Alliance for Peace, which is like the people-centered human rights, and advances towards people-centered human rights when profit isn't the motive. You can see is about a people being whole, and this framework is just an approach that views human rights as an arena of struggle, grounded and informed by the aspirations of the oppressed. So it is, as we're seeing played out, a sort of dictatorship of the proletariat. But more than that, it is a, as Onye spoke to, a planned economy and block by block, and it's people centered. And it's a unified, comprehensive strategy for the decolonization, but also, decolonization and radical change, but also the maintaining of the revolution and the revolutionary objective. So just a reconceptualization of human rights is what we're seeing play out in Cuba and socialist countries that take lead from Cuba, like Venezuela and Nicaragua. And in nations like Cuba building socialism, you see people-centered human rights replicated in their democratic processes, in the family code that Onye spoke to, which ensures full rights. And it's a model what could be even under a crippling blockade. And that in itself exposes the hypocrisy of a capitalist system or the US's use of quote unquote human rights, and explains why nations like Cuba are under a constant attack.
Yeah, the only thing I have to add, I think actually illustrating what the family code is that we've mentioned and how it actually came to be passed into law can really illustrate for people what it's like being under socialism. And so in the US, there are thousands of laws passed every week, maybe even in one state alone, and you're not even aware of this law that will impact you, and you have no input. And as Onye said, it's a direct democracy. In the US, we have a representative democracy, which means we have to go through a chain of middlemen to actually get to, quote unquote, policy making. The family code is a part of Cuba's constitution. It's around 500 to 600 pages long, and it's a legal document that grants rights, protections, of all kinds by the state to anything that can be considered related to the family unit. This includes disabled people, TLGBTQ rights, elderly people. Things like a prenup are now actually permitted in Cuba for the very first time ever, which we might take for granted, but for Cuban women is something that they have led a struggle for, right? And so the family code was originally passed maybe 30 years ago. And for the past 5 years, they have been pushing for a new family code to guarantee more rights and more protection for all of these groups. So in order to pass this family code, they had over 79,000 public debates and forums and discussions, because Cuba is broken up at all the way down to the neighborhood level, not just at a province level. It goes all the way down to your neighborhood representatives. And so in over 79,000 of these meetings, there were over 300,000 proposals to the family code or changes submitted. And the result after these 79,000 meetings was that the new family code was changed over 54%. And then finally, it was actually passed with a majority vote. I think it was something around 70+% of the entire Cuban population voted and passed it. And so just on a very practical level, we don't have anything even similar to that in terms of control over the state and the means of production to have a direct say so in the laws of our, of the land we live on, right? And the last thing I'll say is that Cuban socialism is very, very, very big on mutual comradeship, both in terms of Cubans amongst themselves will organize like neighborhood units and special projects in their park, but all around them, Cuban socialism in the state promotes actual organizing and neighborhood projects amongst the people because they understand with this blockade that the people and the state have to work together. And again, imagine any of us on this call organizing underneath a state that is not antagonistic to us, but is actually trying to help and support us. That is really a very big difference with Cuban socialism. Of course, I can go on, but I'll yield there.
No, we appreciate you. We're just gonna extend the seminar for 9 hours, y'all. So just get ready and y'all can keep talking. No, but no, I appreciate you all very much. I think that Onye starting off and kind of breaking down, first of all, the definition of direct democracy, right? Like I appreciate that and really helping us to understand what that looks like. And going through to you, Comrade Musa, like really hearing what direct democracy looks like in terms of like voices being heard, where we need to have 79,000 different opportunities for us to keep pushing back, keep resisting. No, that's not what I said. You're not capturing that the right way. I think it needs to be like this. And what about these folks over here? We didn't even hear from them and their representative didn't come to this meeting. So how do we still do that where we can literally unsilence these voices and make sure folks are feeling heard? And then Comrade Erica, I really appreciate you just giving us this reminder that this is why we need to have political education, because we need to be able to study different socialists from Marx to Taoism to Encrumis Therese, whatever it looks like, so that we can still be able to apply these different principles based on how we're trying to organize our people. And I think the more people we get exposed to, the more we can understand, okay, that principle may have worked for this group of people. It's not going to work for us because we're African, but at least we understand how it operates so that we can maybe adopt some of those principles and then still move into what works for us. And so I so appreciate the three of you all for giving us your time, but also like really painting this picture for us. Comrade Musa, when you said, imagine being in a space where people are not pushing against you, I just thought like, I don't even know what that looks like. That's why I can't wait to go there. I cannot wait to visit that place. And I can't wait to celebrate that the prenup is now a priority. Like, I'm just very passionate about that. So we're going to take the time to open it up, the questions from the chat, but you all are amazing. And I'm so thankful for you all being here. Comrade Ajamu, are you ready to ask some questions on our people's behalf?
Yes, family. So the first question coming from YouTube folks watching is if any of you could comment on the number of tourists in Cuba from Russia, and if they're, I guess what they're asking is, is there a large percentage of people in Cuba from Russia, and if there's any connection you want to make to the sanctions that exist against Russia and the economic blockade in Cuba. So that's the question.
There you go.
I don't mind taking the first stab at this one. So the majority of tourists who travel to Cuba is from Canada and actually Western Europe. In fact, for about, I believe, 6 to 7 years in a row, Cuba was the top tourist summer vacation spot for Canadians primarily. Prior to the fall of the USSR, there was heavy Russian tourism, but I think we often overinflate the Russian tourism aspect. Really, Soviets were helping Cuba develop, and I think that is actually the more accurate narrative, because in the West, I've heard people say, I want to go to Cuba, but I don't want to be surrounded by Russians and things like that. But so in neighborhoods like Alta Havana, which is like a northern Havana working class neighborhood, the Soviets came in throughout the 70s through the 90s and helped teach them how to form construction brigades and actually help them build tall housing units that they still live in to this day all across the island. The Soviets helped provide infrastructure and development similar to how like the Belt and Road Initiative is currently, doing across the African continent in some regards. And so, but I do think the other aspect politically, of course, is any sanctions against Russia by the US and the West one of their hopes is that any other country that Russia has ties to is economically strangled at the same time. And so Russia today, as well as China, have had really great development and diplomatic ties with Cuba. Cuba has sent them doctors, but also public health professionals, public education professionals. But their ability to support Cuba currently is very, very difficult and limited because of Western sanctions making it that way.
Yeah. I would just add to Musa's point, when the proxy war started in Ukraine, and Russia was sanctioned, I want to say that March, they heavily sanctioned Russia. One of the things that they said publicly, that was reported publicly, that they intended to sanction Russia so heavily so that it can have the effects on nations like Cuba, that were relying on Russia. So I do think that is something to point out in terms of how have the sanctions maybe affected or tourism. The intention of the sanctions was to affect any existing relationship between Russia and Cuba.
And if I could also add one more point too to that I kind of forgot to mention. As Onye mentioned earlier, sanctions, tourism is Cuba's #1 sort of economic lifeline. When Barack Obama eased the blockade slightly in terms of travel and telecommunications businesses, there was actually an 80% increase within just a few weeks once it was legal of tourism from the US, and particularly from the southern US, which we also know is where a majority of Africans in the US are concentrated as well, right? And then once Trump got back in office and reversed that and increased sanctions, there was an 86% drop in Cuba's tourism economy in just a 6-month period. And so whatever sanctions take place against somewhere like Russia, but also Venezuela, Cuba, China, they have a very, very, very direct link on Cuba's economy because especially tourism. And I feel like that might have been what the question was trying to get at a little bit.
But I also want to say there's like a lot of misconceptions, and this is intentionally cultivated. It's the intent of US policy. Like people have a misconception about how difficult it actually is to travel to Cuba, even after the Obama, like Trump like very much shut it down in terms of the Obama era policy. But you actually can like buy a commercial flight to Cuba, get a visa, and go. We always recommend that people travel with like delegations, like politicize the trip. But understand, it's not. You can actually still travel to Cuba from the US like relatively easily. It's like $300 round trip ticket, get a visa, use the support for the Cuban people travel license, and see it for yourself. The reason why the US government is so invested in making people believe that it's difficult to travel to Cuba, the reason why they work so hard to cut down travel between the US and Cuba and from Cuba to the US is because they know that if people go to Cuba and see it for themselves, they'll understand everything they've heard about it is not true. That's precisely what happened to me the first time I went in 2019. I was like, wow, like I thought I knew. I had no idea. I was completely off. And I know a lot of Africans that traveled to Cuba. Like the first friend I made in Orlando, Florida, was this African woman, Nita, who had traveled to Cuba under Obama, who is not political, not socialist, not particularly anti-imperialist, but who loves Cuba, loves Cuban people, loves the Cuban Revolution. She's like, I want to be like that here. So there's like a lot of Africans, regular people who are not necessarily organizers, who took advantage of the opportunity to go to Cuba and who had their minds changed about it. And that's precisely what the US is afraid of and why they work so hard to convince people that it's hard to go there. But I just wanted to let the folks watching know, like, you can go to Cuba. It is still legal to go.
That's cool. Thank you all. I have another question, Shakur, that people, actually a couple of people have asked this. So the question, you all, is if you can break down how the variables of how the economic blockade impacts the people of Cuba. I think people, if I'm trying to interpret the question, I think people, they get it right. Like the US has imposed this thing and it prevents Cuba from being able to do all these things. But I think people are asking, like, what does that look like? What is the economic blockade? What are the impacts on the everyday people in Cuba? If you could address that.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it first. And because I think Anya and Musa can add much more detail. But I would just say from my experience going there, I've been able to travel to Cuba twice, both on delegations. One with BAP, where we launched the Zone of Peace campaign last year, and then also with Hood Communists. And I would say being there, you actually get to see the difficulty in people being able to live every day. And also, there's certain instances where you see that they have come to make the best of it. A lot of it is normalized for them in such a way where they know how to maneuver and know how to live through it. But it is jarring when the power is out, when we're in Matanzas for hours and people are still going about their day. They're still in the restaurant, but it's like, well, the power's out. Or when we're trying to travel and we have to wait 3 or 4 hours just to get a cab because the gas lines are ridiculously long. There's no other kind of transportation because they have to run buses at a certain time because of the oil shortage, things like that. So being able to see that on an everyday level, or even getting meat, um, you know, the it's a lot cheaper. I would say to get pork, but everybody does not eat pork. And when our comrades in Cuba are trying to accommodate us, it is a struggle for them. It is an all-day event for them to find alternatives like chicken and things like that. So being there and seeing that kind of day-to-day sort of thing, I think you can hear the numbers, right? But then seeing how they have to live through that, and then living through that with them I think it's different. And it really puts the issues of the blockade to the forefront because it is an everyday thing that they experience, even with the trash. The lack of trash pickup is a result of they can't drive. There's not a sufficient amount of oil. So that becomes an issue. And I can also see, to their point, well, to the point of the blockade, right? The point of it is to squeeze people enough where they, one, have to feel like they have to leave, or two, feel like they have to agitate the government to make some sort of move by protesting, and where they can then exploit the protests like I named in July 2021. But those are the conditions that I was able to just see in the just the, I guess, the calm, if add up the 2 times I was there, maybe 20 days that I was there, just being able to see that on its face was a, yeah, you can definitely see what the effects are.
Erica spoke really, really well to the everyday effects, and I would definitely echo that. I remember the first time I went to Cuba in 2019, there were rolling blackouts because it's an island. They don't produce oil. They have to import all of their oil. And they had purchased oil actually from Venezuela, and then the US Navy intercepted the ship. Oil was bought and paid for. US Navy took the ship. Cuba didn't have oil. Cuba could not put its lights on. When we were there this past February, we saw long lines for gas, and that's like one of the points of attack of the imperialist media. They're like, there's lines for food, there's lines for gas, but they never say that the reason why there are these long, long, long lines is because the US is intentionally strangling Cuba's capacity to import necessary goods like oil, like grain, like food. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that the US State Department, Cuba currently has Cuba on its list of so-called state sponsors of terrorism. And just off top, like, that is absurd. When it comes to like US relations with Cuba, like, the US has literally funded and backed terrorist attacks against Cuban civilians for decades. The US is a global force of international terror. Cuba is a global force of international peace. It is absurd. It is extremely cynical that Cuba has been put on that list, but its position on that list means that Cuba literally cannot engage in the global banking system. They can't engage in wire transfers. They can't process credit card payments. They can't get loans they need to do like basic infrastructure projects or get materials for their people to survive. So like Cuba's position on that list means that they have a drastically reduced capacity to meet the needs of their people. So there's like literally an every single day impact for every single person. And there's the most marginalized sectors of Cuban society, like African people, like queer people, like disabled people, like elders, who are feeling that impact most acutely. When people talk about the economic blockade in the United States, they talk about it as an attack on communism, an attack on the Cuban state or the Cuban Communist Party. That's not true. It's an attack on the Cuban people, and it's an intentional attack on the Cuban people.
And I
Thank you.
think,
Oh,
oh,
go ahead.
sorry.
I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, you know, there's a 1960 memorandum from the Secretary of State basically laying out why they're choosing the blockade and what that strategy entails. And they open up the very first point they make, and again, this is from the mouth of the beast itself. They say that the majority of Cubans overwhelmingly support Castro, and the lowest estimate they could find was still over 50% of support for Castro. And then on top of that, they say, quote, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. So they're laying this strategy right out. So I know Cubans who we met when we were there. Norma Guillard, for example, is a very, very famous African Cuban psychologist. She not single-handedly, but she helped to integrate the needs of TLGBTQ people into Cuba's public health system. She had a surgery 2 summers ago, and she had to bring the gloves for the doctors and the nurses to use because there were no gloves in the hospital that day. I have friends and close comrades who have ailments that can be fixed with over-the-counter medicine. Something as simple as ibuprofen could cost your entire month's salary. And so when we bring suitcases full of things to donate, the Cubans are also sharing these donations and spreading them throughout their entire neighborhoods because they already know which houses have diabetes, which houses house an elderly or disabled person, and they're spreading and resharing these resources. But the condition is, you know, if you could imagine being somewhere and having a strong, powerful empire dictating what you can and cannot import, very similar to what Israel does to Gaza, right? There's like a amount of calories that they won't let them import. They won't let certain medicines go into Gaza. The US is, I like to call Cuba an open air prison because the blockade even restricts travel. You know, Cubans, the US embassy left Cuba because of fake sonic attack claims, quote unquote. And that means that Cubans who want to travel have to go to a third party. They have to go to a whole nother country just to apply for a visa. And so the blockade is not being dramatic when we say it is literally impacting them at every single way possible.
All right, you all, we have time for, there are a couple of more questions, but before we get to those, I just wanted to really just thank all three of you. As a person who, you know, I've been in AAPRP a long time, which means I've been a Pan-Africanist and a socialist for a long time. You know, I didn't vote for Obama either time. I haven't voted for none of those crackers and wannabe crackers. So I just have a different perspective than a lot of people in this country, right? Like I don't, and it's like a personal irritation that you never get a chance to hear socialism talked about in the realm that it should be talked about. And I feel like you all have done an outstanding job of doing that. And based on how people are commenting, I think people really are benefiting from that. And so you really just make this old head happy because this is what I live for. So thank you for that. And I'm just going to try to combine a couple of questions that came up. The first one is the question of, well, first, someone is asking, like, where do they learn about planned economy? And I'll just step in and say, like, you know, family, you really just, the only way to do that, you got to study that. You know, there's a number of books. If you want to reach out to us, we don't have time right now, but if you want to reach out to us, I can give you 10 or so books on socialist planned economy that you can read that will really just break it down for you. And these are recently written books. So if you want to know more about that, just reach out to us at betterworld.me. Happy to give you that information. But the questions that people have are, one is, the question is, I'm kind of going to try to combine these, right? Like the question is, what would you all say, how do you explain how Cuba is able to still encourage people to come there despite the economic challenges that the blockade has imposed on the island? And then along with that, would you comment on, Cuba's, I guess, engaging in this process of normalizing relationships with countries like South Korea? I guess the question is like, what is the political objective behind them potentially doing that? So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I actually think those are directly related questions, and I can definitely start us off. Cuba makes an extraordinary sacrifice to host conferences and delegations of the nature that we participated in. And we have to understand it as part of an intentional internationalist strategy being carried out by the Cuban Revolution. Like they are incredibly strategic and clear about the geopolitics of the world. Like they are like, we are going to be a net force for good. We are going to attempt to have relations with everybody that we can. We are going to encourage folks to come to the island to see it from themselves, including from the belly of the beast, so they can go back and talk to their communities about what's going on in Cuba. This is a long-term intentional strategy carried out on Cuba's part to attempt to isolate its enemies. And it has been extremely successful. Like it's not a coincidence that they are putting so much resources into hosting delegations like the Vencenamis Brigade, hosting the Theoretical Conference of the Left. Like it's a great sacrifice because they're in a new special period. They're in an economic blockade. They have shortages of so many goods, but the sacrifice is worth it to them because it's a means like building their relationships with the entire rest of the planet. So I feel like we have to understand this kind of work, these kind of delegations, these conferences within the context of an intentional and successful strategy carried out by Cuba. The other thing I'll say, I lost my train of thought, so maybe I'll pass it, and then if I remember it, I'll give it back.
Yeah, I would just piggyback off of what you just said. I think that is why that conference focused so much on unity as a strategic tool. They do, even when we talk about the U.S. to our comrades who are organizing in Havana and in different places, they don't, not that they don't understand what we're saying, they just don't have a particular understanding of what we're saying because they have a focus on unity. So for them, it's like, we get it, but so they listen, but they also try to figure out ways where they can not circumvent that, but still work within that framework. So even as we would say, there's people who we would rather not come on delegations because their politics are just not the best. The Cubans are saying, bring them, have them come, because they understand the political objective. And I think this goes again to that the planned economy. Like they do strategically think ahead. And they're thinking ahead, not in order to change these people's ideologies in any way, but change their perspective on Cuba so that when they come to Cuba, they can go back and tell the truth about what they've seen. And even to Onye's point, the person that they met in Florida, it doesn't have any particular political tendency, but they love Cuba. And from what they were able to see and experience in Cuba, it's enough for them to go back and say, no, wait. That's not what I experienced. Wait, hold on. That's not what I heard when I was there. That's not what I saw when I was there. And that's what they want to encourage. They always want to encourage telling the truth about what we've seen. And I think that's what made the conference so pivotal, because they invited a particular set of people, right? They invited the international left, but the international left wing media, because they understood there's conversations that we need to have as media entities about how do we then tell the truth about what we're seeing, and what is the strategic tool, and how do we unify that message across these different languages, across these different tendencies, across these different countries. And I think that's really how Cuba models that sort of need for unity in spite of these other issues that may come up.
Got it back. Erica reminded me because you're so good. Okay, so the US government attempted to assassinate Fidel Castro over 300 times. They tried to kill that man so many times, and he died of old age surrounded by people that loved him. They failed. But I share that because even though they were constantly trying to assassinate Fidel Castro, constantly trying to overthrow the Cuban Revolution, there was never a point when the Cuban government was not open to having like a principled conversation with the US. Throughout the entire history of the US directly antagonizing Cuba, attempting to destabilize Cuba, attempting to assassinate their elected leaders, Cuba was always like, do you want to talk? Do you want some doctors? Do you want some resources? Like, can we just like work together the whole time? And again, that is part of that intentional strategy to build international solidarity, even with people in the US, even with the US government, even with South Korea, and also a way for them to isolate the US, to isolate Israel, who always votes for the US, to uphold the US blockade on Cuba. There's an intentional strategy. And they definitely see it. Like, we bring delegations to Cuba, and they are intentionally like big tent, like meaning there's people from all kinds of organizations, all kinds of like political tendencies, all kinds of perspectives on Cuba. Like, it's intentionally a very big tent within the Bencinemos Brigade, within the Mayday Brigade, etc. And always, every time we bring people from the US, they bring their beef, they bring their organizational beef to Cuba with them. And every single time, the Cubans are like, we hear you, get over it. Figure out how to work together, figure out what unites you, and move through it. Like, they hear us out, they're like, okay, I get it. This happened, this person said this. We don't care. Figure it out. Like, they are constantly, constantly, constantly encouraging us to figure out how to move past what divides us and unify and move based on what like keeps us together, the shared enemies, the shared vision of the future, etc. And that is something that I have learned a lot. Like, one of the deepest lessons that I've taken from my time in Cuba, from the Cuban Revolution itself, is that there is always a basis of unity between forces in the left. And we have this tendency within the US left and within the Western left in general to focus on what divides us, to focus on our differences and use that as an excuse to not build towards a bigger objective. And I feel like the example of Cuba, how it has successfully carried out this strategy to build international solidarity to isolate its enemies while still maintaining an open door, shows us that that is actually the way to do it. No matter what we tell ourselves, we are not moving in a revolutionary direction if we allow what divides us to stop us from trying to figure out how to work together.
And I'll just quickly add to that because Anya really summed it up so wonderfully. In terms of isolation, Cuba forces us to actually flip the camera around and realize it's the US that's isolated. And what I mean, and one example of that is this past November in 2023, there was a UN vote to end the blockade, a resolution on ending the blockade. And for 31 years in a row, the entire world voted against the blockade. And the only ones who voted in support of it was the US, the Zionist entity, and Ukraine. And this is 31 years in a row. And so Cuba, like most socialist states in history, has said that they're willing to have relations with anyone especially because the blockade does not afford them the luxury to seek out ideological purity, I guess. And they're up against their very real material conditions. And in terms of inviting people to come, I've had Cuban revolutionaries and politicians, they're like, y'all can come and stay and just be a tourist. We just want you to come. Like we always tell people, join the Vince Ramos Brigade, join different brigades. But Cubans genuinely, especially Africans in the US and from other Caribbean nations, Cubans want to meet other Africans. The Cuban Revolution was an African revolution because every single time we take people, I think I've done about a dozen delegations now, and people arrive at the airport and they're like, I didn't realize I was going to an African nation because, so we view the Cuban, as Pan-Africanists, we really should view the Cuban Revolution as an African revolution. And in fact, even most Cubans will tell you, Fidel Castro himself said, this is an African island. I have an African heart. That's why we have supported African liberation movements, over and over again, right? Because they understand themselves as Africans, even the non-African Cubans. Me and Erica were joking last time we were there because they have and it's a genuine love for African history and culture. because they understand themselves as being part of that. And so Cuba welcomes everybody, and that is honestly, it's like putting what we call principles of unity in action at the highest level possible, you know.
That is awesome. Thank you all so, so much. Y'all, let's give it up for them. Even if you cannot be on Zoom, you should be clapping right now because this was an amazing presentation. Thank you all so much. So I know we were at the top of the hour. If you all want to briefly just share any updates for Hood Communist Collective or your respected organizations, we would love to hear any announcements you all have briefly as we close out. And then Comrade Ajamu, if you want to share that last slide, I can announce the next topic for next week. Thank y'all so much for being here.
So, two announcements. One is that we are launching our Hood Communist YouTube channel. Woo! So you can search it on YouTube, Hood Communist. Just search for Hood Communist on YouTube and you'll find the channel. Our very first stream is going to be yet another report back on our time in Cuba. It's happening next Sunday, St. Patrick's Day, March 16th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time to 11 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll be live on YouTube. And if you can't catch the live stream, you can also watch the recording, of course, on our YouTube channel. So please search it, Hood Communist on YouTube. Please subscribe. And please join us on Sunday, March 17th, 9 a.m. Eastern for our report back. And then also, if you, after hearing us talk about our time in Cuba and what we took from the conference, if you yourself are interested in traveling to Cuba this year, the 52nd contingent of the Benson Emis Brigade is traveling to Guantanamo, the Guantanamo province, not the Guantanamo military base. It's a whole province that the U.S. is occupying. So we're traveling to Guantanamo in the eastern part of Cuba, July 17th to July 30th. The application is currently open. It is open until March 31st. So if you would like to travel to Cuba within the context of a contingent, the oldest Cuba Solidarity delegation in the US, and learn directly from the Cuban people about what the impact of the occupation of Guantanamo is like, then please join us on the 52nd contingent of the Benson Emis Brigade. Go to bbforcuba.com and I'll put it in the chat. Please apply.
Other announcements, comrades?
I just wanted to quickly shout out Sister Erica. Her and I co-hosted an episode of the Groundings podcast, speaking with Hiram Rivera about the nonprofit industrial complex and how capitalism co-ops our movements essentially. And so everyone listening, go check that out. Erica, me, and Hiram Rivera. And then just because I quickly have the mic, want to say Stop Cop City. What we're talking about with Cuba and the blockade is deeply connected to Cop City, because the same way that the US is militarizing the Latin American and Caribbean region through the blockade, they are militarizing and occupying African communities here in Atlanta. And thank y'all again for having me.
Yeah, I just want to quickly say Hood Communists every Thursday. We have new articles. If you want to read the statements that we offered at the conference, please go check out the site. We have returned to our Telegram PE, so be on the lookout for those. We just did our first one, so we'll be releasing that at Hood Communist Radio soon enough. Give us some time because we're still organizers as well. But yeah, deeply, deeply appreciate the opportunity to talk about Cuba, to support Cuba. You can visit blackallianceforpeace.com and support and learn about the Zone of Peace campaign. And yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I just subscribed to the Hood Communist Collective YouTube channel. Y'all better get on it. Y'all better subscribe while it's fresh on your memory. Maybe you got a better memory than me, but go ahead and subscribe. Hit that like button. You know how they say. Thank y'all so much. Y'all are amazing. We appreciate y'all. My head is spinning. I have so many things I want to follow up on. Thank you, Onye, for that link. I'm gonna really try to make that happen. So thank you. Thank you for providing that. Okay, so we hope to see you back next week. Don't forget, you have two broadcasts now. You should be joining the Hood Communist Collective YouTube channel so you can hear their broadcast. But also, if you are able to join us next week on Sunday, 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Pacific Standard, we will be talking about Africans who consider themselves to be spokespeople, and they really are more so non-African and more so Negro, if you will, for the capitalist white right. Okay, so next week on Sunday, we'll be talking about confused Africans who are spokespeople for capitalist white right. Make sure that you scan the QR code in the upper left corner so you can get a list of all the All African People Revolutionary Party broadcasts, seminars, podcasts, broadcast, all of those things, all the times and everything is on that QR code. Definitely, if you are inspired by anything you heard today and you are African, we would love for you to visit the All African People's Revolutionary Party website. You see it at the bottom left, www.aaprp-intl.org. If you are not African, but you're interested in joining an organization that is working for justice because you heard from 4 different organizers today, including Comrade Ajamu, then you should definitely reach out to abetterworld.me, and Comrade Ajamu can give you some tips on starting an organization with your respected people. Definitely make sure you buy A Guide for Organizing Defense Against White Supremacist, Patriarchal, and Fascist Violence. That book is the manifesto continuance and update of the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare that we mentioned earlier from Kwame Nkrumah. And this guide gives you steps based on what your interest is for starting an organization and focusing on a specific topic that your organization may be able to attend to. Last but not least, the bottom right corner, please scan that QR code. We're still raising money for our comrades in Burkina Faso, so they too can raise money so that they can have books to give to our African children. We do not want our children reading Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer. We want our children reading books about other revolutionary Pan-Africanists so that they can learn about who they are, they can be more informed, most importantly, so that they can have political education that hopefully they can use to join an organization that's working for justice one day. So with that, we will close out. We apologize for going over on time, but we had a special treat today, so we think it's okay. We look forward to seeing you all next week. Be safe, everyone. We are winning. Smash capitalism, imperialism, homophobia, transphobia, any systems of oppression. They gotta go, especially patriarchy. All right, forward, y'all. Peace.
Thank you. That was amazing.
That was great.
Yes, thank you.
What a good host. Okay, bye, y'all.
Bye.